Is Donald Trump negotiating the Iran deal version 2? And what's the latest on the potential trade war between the US, China, and Europe? We're going to look at all this and more on today's Trumpet World. Once again, I'm traveling this week, so I've asked each of the panelists to send in a short update of the latest news from their region. First, we're going to hear from Mihailo Zekic, who has an update on the Iranian nuclear negotiation. Then we'll hear the latest in the trade war from Andrew Miller, and then from Jeremiah for a perspective from Asia, before I chime in with Europe's reaction at the end.
We will do a follow-up of the nuclear negotiations that happened in Muscat, Oman, between the United States and Iran. Lot to get to. A lot of details have surfaced from what actually happened there. U.S. envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff, met Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi to establish a framework for future talks. We don't have an official statement on the blow-by-blow what happened, who said what from the U.S. government or from the Iranians, but some very, very interesting details have surfaced from media, including from Witkoff himself.
This is not a threat on my part now. It is just a simple fact. The president means what he says, which is they cannot have a bomb. The conversation with the Iranians will be much about two critical points. One, enrichment. As you mentioned, they do not need to enrich past 3.67%. In some circumstances, they're at 60%. In other circumstances, 20%. That cannot be. And you do not need to run, as they claim, a civil nuclear program where you're enriching past 3.67%. So this is going to be much about verification on the enrichment program, and then ultimately verification on weaponization. That includes missiles, the type of missiles that they have stockpiled there, and it includes the trigger for a bomb.
Now, notice exactly what he said there, that Iran doesn't have a reason to enrich past 3.6%, which is the standard civilian nuclear enrichment levels, implying that they do have permission or an acceptance to enrich up to that point, that they do have a right to have their nuclear technology intact, to just scale everything back. Before this, the signals we were getting from the White House, from the Israeli government, was that Iran would follow, or if a nuclear deal was to be reached, it would be following the Libya model, when Libya completely dismantled its nuclear program in 2003 and handed everything away to the Americans. That's not the sense that we're getting from Witkoff here. And what the Iranians are saying is that that's not actually what Witkoff told them. Ynet News, citing an Iranian official, said, quote, "The draft proposal brought by Witkoff to the first round did not include a demand for dismantling Iran's nuclear infrastructure or any explicit military threat, conditions that have led to the collapse of previous talks," end quote. You can imagine there was a lot of right-wing media in Israel and the United States that pounced on Witkoff's comments there, and I think he was taken a little bit by surprise at how much people picked this up. While that was going on, his office tweeted out some damage control. This is what they sent out, quote, "A deal with Iran will only be completed if it is a Trump deal. Any final arrangement must set a framework for peace, stability, and prosperity in the Middle East, meaning that Iran must stop and eliminate its nuclear enrichment and weaponization program. It is imperative for the world that we create a tough, fair deal that will endure, and that is what President Trump has asked me to do," end quote. So on the one hand, he's saying they can enrich, just not to scary levels. On the other hand, he's saying they cannot enrich at all. What exactly is Witkoff's policy? What exactly is President Trump's policy? Well, Iran, for their part, after Witkoff put that tweet out, accused him of moving the goalposts. And on April 17th, we got a pretty eye-opening look as to some of the details, if this is to be confirmed, on what Witkoff was presenting as the U.S.'s platform. Iran International published on April 17th an article about what Iran's position was, citing 3 diplomatic sources, their words. Bit of a longer quote, but it's an important one. Quote, Tehran proposed that in the first stage, it would temporarily reduce its uranium enrichment level to 3.67% in exchange for access to financial assets frozen by the United States and permission to export its oil. In the second phase, the sources added, Iran would permanently end high-level enrichment and restore the United Nations nuclear watchdog's inspections if the United States lifts further sanctions on Iran and persuades Britain, Germany, and France to refrain from triggering the so-called snapback of UN sanctions on Tehran. In this phase, Iran would also commit to implementing the additional protocol, a supplementary agreement that allows the UN nuclear watchdog to carry out surprise inspections at sites not declared to the agency. The third and final stage calls for the U.S. Congress to approve the nuclear agreement and for Washington to lift both primary and secondary sanctions, while Iran would transfer its highly enriched uranium stockpiles to a third country, end quote. In a nutshell, this is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. This is Obama's nuclear deal. This is Iran's entire position, and it's actually worse than the JCPOA. Technically, that was never approved by Congress. There was a bit of legal wrangling President Obama did there to make it outside of the oversight of Congress. Iran is basically saying that if you want another deal, we want you to give us everything Obama gave us, including the names of the protocols that were in the deal, and we want you to ensure Congress approves it. Because Congress didn't approve it last time, President Trump in his first term was able to withdraw just with signing a piece of paper. But they're saying, no, we want everything that Obama gave us, plus ironclad guarantees that you or anybody else is not going to be able to sign it away with the stroke of a pen. What was Mr. Witkoff's reaction to this? The Iran International article continues, quote, U.S. envoy Witkoff welcomed the proposals presented by the Iranian side, the sources told Iran International, surprising the Iranian delegation in Muscat. So Witkoff is fully on board with this, and I'm sure he communicated back to his boss, President Trump, to other people like Defense Secretary Hegseth, some of these other people involved in the U.S. security apparatus, that this was the Iranian position and that he accepted it. And at the very least, they have a pretty strong advocate for this in Witkoff. And the fact that President Trump is still entrusting him with these nuclear negotiations, still letting him keep doing what he's doing, suggests that at the very least, he's open to doing this, open to signing a worse deal than what he exited in his first term. The negotiations are set to continue as of tomorrow in Rome, Italy. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni reportedly extended the invitation. Italy was one of the European countries that was not part of the previous peace negotiations. Britain, France, and Germany were. Italy wasn't, and reportedly Italy felt excluded and wanted to make sure they have a seat at the table this time. But how is everybody feeling with all of this, with everything we just talked about, with a renewed JCPOA? Well, continuing from the Ynet article, quote, though not officially stated, officials in Jerusalem have privately acknowledged that a potential agreement under the current U.S. administration would be viewed as deeply problematic, especially given expectations that Trump will not remain in office beyond his current term, end quote. Israel, they're nervous about this, and rightly so. I mean, we've played on this program, we played on our sister programs, the Trumpet Daily, the Key of David, Benjamin Netanyahu's statements throughout the years saying that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. The JCPOA helps them to have a nuclear weapon, and this is an existential threat to the state of Israel, if not Western civilization as a whole. When Mr. Trump was campaigning back last autumn, Israel was hoping that if he won, they would bring back some of what he did in the first term, when he put his maximum pressure campaign on Iran, when he forced the Islamic regime to backpedal, when he left the nuclear agreement. And Now it looks like he's doing a complete 180, and you can imagine that Israeli officials don't really know how to react to this. If Trump was their best hope to get somebody in the White House to sort out the Iranian mess, and this is the result, then what can they expect from everybody else in America? What can they expect from anybody else wanting to run in the presidency? That's Israel's position anyway. Europe's not too keen, apparently, on this either. You mentioned Italy, but the French foreign minister, Jean-Noël Barrot, also sent out a statement on Monday, quote, "We will be vigilant, along with our British and German friends and partners, to ensure that any negotiations that may take place comply with our security interests with regard to Iran's nuclear program," end quote. Now, for longtime followers of the Trump idea, rewind back to when we were talking about the JCPOA in 2015 and 2016, Europe, France, Germany, these countries, they were among the most ardent supporters of the deal. They wanted Iran to open up to the West, to economic investment. They wanted to do business with Iran. And now you're having the French foreign minister come out saying, with these negotiations going JCPOA 2.0, a JCPOA plus, and they're saying, we're not even sure that this will comply with our security interests. We want confirmation. We don't have good faith, or we're not optimistic, at least, with what's going on, and neither are the British or the Germans. There's one other country I'd like to throw in here that I think is pretty telling. It also ties in with the United States. On last Sunday, Energy Secretary Chris Wright was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, announcing that the U.S. is restarting its nuclear negotiations with Saudi Arabia. He said that they're going to be talking about what he called a commercial nuclear power industry, helped set up by the Americans, and that there would be, his words, meaningful developments for in this end this year. Now, this is taking up a program that the Biden administration was trying to push through back in the late summer, fall of 2023. This was derailed by the October 7th attack, but the negotiations were supposed to be that the U.S. is to help Saudi Arabia build a civilian nuclear program in exchange for Saudi recognizing Israel's right to exist and normalizing relations. Why did that not go through? Again, I mentioned October 7th, which threw all geopolitics in the Middle East in a bit of a turmoil, but also the Biden administration was hoping that, or at least they were a bit suspicious that Saudi Arabia was going to weaponize this program and use it for a nuclear program of itself, and they wanted certain safeguards, like Saudi Arabia importing enriched uranium rather than having the technology to enrich it itself. And Saudi Arabia said, no, that's not what we want to have. Officially, again, they're claiming this is just for civilian purposes, but this is what Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who effectively runs the country under his father, King Salman, said in 2023 in a Fox News interview.
When we are concerned of any country getting a nuclear weapon, that's a bad move, and you don't need to get a nuclear weapon because you cannot use it. Even if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, any country use a nuclear weapon, that means they are having a war with the rest of the world. The world cannot see another Hiroshima. If the world see 100,000 people dead, that means you are in a war with the rest of the world. So it's a useless effort to reach a nuclear weapon because you cannot use it. If you use it, you got to have a big fight with the rest of the world.
If they get one, will you?
If they get one, we have to get one for security reasons, for balancing power in the Middle East, but we don't want to see that.
So you can see that he himself, the leader of Saudi Arabia himself, said that Iran, if they get a nuclear bomb, we need to get a nuclear bomb. It's like Trump's talking with everybody in the Middle East and saying, okay, you can have your nuclear program. You can have your nuclear program. Nukes everywhere. This is, and in the most volatile region in the world, in the Middle East, where wars happen frequently, like Saudi Arabia, that's where most of the 9/11 terrorists came from, the prominent ones at least. Even if you could trust Mohammed bin Salman, can you trust everybody in his government? There's a lot of debate on how complicit the Saudi government was in the 9/11 terror attacks. This is madness. This is nuclear madness in the most dangerous part of the world you could possibly introduce it to. Again, there are divisions within Trump's cabinet, reportedly. You have people like National Security Advisor Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, wanting a more hawkish approach, a bit skeptical of Iran's intentions. Then you have Witkoff and Vice President Vance and some other figures that are pushing for a negotiated settlement to avoid a war. President Trump, he's obviously surrounded by these people. These are the people that feed information on how to make decisions, so perhaps he himself isn't completely sure what to do going forward. But there's one other wrinkle to this, and again, this is the Israeli factor that was made clear in a very eye-opening New York Times article on April 16th called "Trump Waved Off Israeli Strike After Divisions Emerged in His Administration." This is a few small quotes from that. Quote, "Israel had planned to strike Iranian nuclear sites as soon as next month, but was waved off by President Trump in recent weeks in favor of negotiating a deal with Tehran to limit its nuclear program, according to administration officials and others briefed on the discussions. In private discussions, Mr. Trump made clear to Mr. Netanyahu that he would not provide American support for an Israeli attack in May while negotiations were playing out." End quote. Now, aside from the fact that this in and of itself is quite a startling admission, the fact that the New York Times got a hold of this information and was able to put it out suggests a very deliberate leak. And there's a lot of discussion around on who did the leak. Is it maybe Prime Minister Netanyahu's helped make it to help show that he was wanting to be tough on Iran? That's what some people are saying. His critics are saying they'll say anything to make him look bad. But this is what one author on the Jerusalem Post, the conclusion he reached, quote, "The leak of Israeli plans to the New York Times appears to be an American attempt to send a message to Khamenei," that's the supreme leader of Iran, "about how close he came to losing his nuclear program and how close he could come if the current nuclear talks do not succeed," end quote. So in other words, again, this is one person's analysis, there's other opinions out there, but I think that's pretty credible. And if that's the case, then America is not trying to defend Israel with these talks. America is using Israel as a pawn, as a stick to get Iran to sign a deal. Mr. Fleury, we played a few clips from his Key of David programs last week about the perspective of what Iranian nuclear weapons means for the world. Here's another one from that same episode that we played from 2015.
One of the recent leader over Iran, the last president, who was under the control of the Supreme Ayatollah, said this. He has stated that our revolution's main mission is to pave the way for the reappearance of the 12th Imam. It is not surprising that many Iran experts assert that Ahmadinejad sees Iran's acquisition of nuclear weapons as means of paving the way for the Mahdi's arrival. Indeed, many of the adherents to these associations believe that the destruction of Israel is a prerequisite for the Mahdi's appearance. In other words, maybe they have to attack and destroy Israel before the Mahdi will even return, they think. And they think that will hasten his return. Who believes such a thing as that? None of the nuclear powers, not even North Korea, believes that.
Now you listen to that, a bit of time has passed. Ahmadinejad hasn't been in the government for years. Even by Iranian standards, his views were a bit extreme. But the same general worldview is what Khamenei and everybody under him believes. Iran is not a democracy. You cannot get into the government like this without at least subscribing to this Islamic revolutionary worldview. And Mr. Fleur was talking about Barack Obama's nuclear deal and how this is going to help enable the destruction of Israel that way. This is the same deal that the Trump administration is negotiating. This will progress to the same end. And Israel can see that if it's not stopped. So whether the current administration realizes it or not, America, through this kind of nuclear deal, is helping Iran destroy Israel. Now, again, exactly what President Trump is thinking, what his different people are thinking around him remains to be seen. It remains to be seen which view will prevail. But if America keeps going down on this course, or even if there are misgivings, even if there are negotiations in Washington and they're too fraught that the president decides to just sit down and do nothing and figure that out and lets everything steamroll, go ahead, full steam ahead as is, that is going to create a disaster for the state of Israel, for America, and for the rest of the world. If you'd like to have more details about that, what I could recommend is listening to our April 11th Trumpet Daily program, our sister program, titled Trump Gives Israel the Obama Treatment. We can link to it in the show notes, which gives a bit more of a deep dive into America's current dealings with Israel, how it's really betraying Israel, not just with the Iran negotiations, but in other ways, and some of the deeper issues at play here.
The America-China decoupling has had its cross the Rubicon moment this week. Finally, after years of building tensions between America and Chinese trade, and conservatives in the United States warning that we're over-reliant on China, and that China would have the power to cut us off from strategic minerals in the event of a geopolitical crisis, it finally happened. China cut us off from rare earth mineral refining exports, and President Donald Trump has increased tariffs on some Chinese goods all the way up to 245%. Actually, because there's different tariffs at different levels, overall it looks like there's pretty much a 42% effective tariff on all Chinese goods, with some goods up to 245%, meaning that if Donald Trump holds to these and no more back down or no more pauses, the World Trade Organization estimates that American trade with China is going to fall over 80%. So right now, China's, I believe, our third biggest trade partner after the United States and Mexico. China's our third biggest trade partner after Canada and Mexico. We're buying about $500 billion worth of goods from them each year, and that's getting ready to plummet 80%. So this is a huge geopolitical realignment where America and China, who for 30, 40 years have been characterized mostly as frenemies, geopolitical rivals who are economically dependent on each other in kind of this toxic codependent relationship, look like they're pretty firmly parting ways. China's looking for new trade partners, trying to reach out to Europe, and America's really starting to offshore some industry already, with some big semiconducting factories opening up in Arizona and Texas this year. So this is a trend the trumpets watched for a long time. In our April 2021 edition, we had the Chinese dragon wrapped around the Statue of Liberty on the cover, talked about beware the threat from China. We had another article published around the same time titled like the U.S. China divorce is prophesied, highlighting prophecies in Deuteronomy 28 and Isaiah 23 about these two opposing trade blocs, this mart of nations composed of China and Europe, against the United States. And for years, that prophecy really couldn't have been fulfilled because China was so dependent on exporting goods to the United States, and the United States was so dependent on importing goods from China. And so now we're starting to see this decoupling where the two trade blocs are no longer dependent on each other, but actually antagonistic to each other. So a prophecy a long time in the making, and really exciting to see as this is actually fulfilled and how fast it was fulfilled. Donald Trump's first term, there was a sizable dip in American trade with China, but nothing anywhere near this 80% dip that is being predicted if Donald Trump sticks with these 245% tariffs. And it looks like he's backed off on his tariffs on most other nations, but stayed strong on his tariffs with China, looking like the American economy may have the political will to pull this off. I've seen a number of articles this morning talking about like America's crossing the Rubicon moment, highlighting that like famous moment in Roman history when Julius Caesar took his army across the Rubicon to invade Rome, and then uttering the famous phrase, "the die is cast," basically saying that like once you'd crossed that river, which was a boundary, there was no going back. And it looks like up till just a few weeks ago, it looked like Donald Trump, he could have backed off on this, but a number of people are thinking that the Rubicon has been crossed, and this trade war and this divorce between the Chinese-American economies is something that is going forward quite strongly. Also, highlighting a longtime prophecy Herbert Armstrong had made all the way back in 1956, having written a paragraph that we quote often, warning about communism in general, saying that we're not fighting a single nation in a military war, but a gigantic worldwide plainclothes army masquerading as a political party, seeking to conquer the world with an entirely new type of warfare. It's a kind of warfare we don't understand or know how to cope with. It uses every diabolical means to weaken us from within, sapping our strength, perverting our morals, sabotaging our education system, wrecking our social structure, destroying our spiritual and religious life, weakening our industrial and economic power, demoralizing our armed forces, and finally, after such infiltration, overthrowing our government with force and violence. These are a prediction Mr. Armstrong made that we've often highlighted in regards to like domestic communist subversion in U.S. academia. But really when it comes to destroying our industrial and economic base, the main communist force that has done that is the Chinese Communist Party, by just sapping so much industry from America. And weakening us in ways we don't fully understand. It's definitely a positive development that Donald Trump is pushing back against that, and bringing some of this industry back to the United States. But of course, the strategic vulnerability here is that before this Chinese infiltration, this communist infiltration, America had the robust enough economy to withstand a trade siege like this, to where now we're finally standing up to it, but our economy is quite anemic compared to what it once was. So that's my main story for this week, just more on trade war. I think this is the third week in a row where I've talked about tariffs or trade war, just taking it from different angles. But there are some other news stories in America. I'll just give a quick rundown on. The Department of Education froze over $2 billion in funding to Harvard University after it refused to fight some of the anti-Semitism problems it's been struggling with on campus. So again, another really black mark on Harvard to show that they're having this many problems with anti-Israel and anti-Semitic protests. They're really doing nothing about it. And so hopefully if they continue to do nothing about it, that $2 million in frozen funding will just end up as another Doge savings program. Also, in another Doge-related move, Elon Musk's department has recommended, and it looks like he's been approved, to deactivate 500,000 credit cards after having found that there's actually twice as many government credit cards as there are government employees. So we've got about 2.3 million government employees, and apparently an average of 2 government credit cards per employee. And so hoping to cut some spending down by at least nixing 500,000 of those to make it a little easier for the government to keep track on who's spending what. And then our last big story in the American region this week is just another crazy liberal lawfare story where the Supreme Court ruled that Donald Trump could actually deport illegal immigrants who are gang members. as long as he gave them adequate time to challenge their deportation in court. And now we've got Democrats actively protesting, saying that we need to bring some of these Venezuelan and Nicaraguan and El Salvadorian gang members back because they were reported before they could have their day in court. And so these are people who are not American citizens, and you've basically got people in America arguing that pretty much anyone on earth who comes to America has constitutional rights and cannot be deported without a hearing from a sympathetic liberal judge. Something the Supreme Court has not upheld, and is really just another big curse on America, making Donald Trump's job to defend America's border a lot harder. He's done a good job at defending the border. That's actually one of the things he's done really well on, but they're definitely seeing American liberals go kicking and screaming, trying to stop him from being able to do that.
The big story for Asia is that China is fighting back against President Trump's efforts to make trade between China and the U.S. more fair. So China has been a dragon in the global marketplace for decades. The Chinese system is built on theft of other nations' intellectual property. It's built on spying and currency manipulation. The Chinese government also forces many of the nation's people into slave labor or some arrangement that's close to it. And that means that they're able to produce goods at a price that no one else can really compete with. And then if other companies are still able to compete with it, the Chinese government steps in and subsidizes those Chinese companies so that they can sell at unbelievably low prices, which end up bankrupting their competitors in other nations. So China really has been living the way of get on a national level. It has been an extremely exploitative trade partner to the U.S. and many nations around the world. And President Trump wanted to put an end to that exploitation, or to at least reduce it. So he increased tariffs on Chinese goods back on April 2nd. He raised them to 54%, which was a major increase, and then he raised it a few days later up to 104%. Mr. Trump hoped that the jolt of that would sort of help the Chinese to admit that they've been self-serving, and he hoped that it would bring them to the negotiation table. But that's not how it has gone. First, China decided to retaliate by raising tariffs on U.S. goods. It raised them up to 84%. Then, of course, the U.S. raised the tariffs on Chinese goods once again up to 145%. And then China raised their tariffs up to 125%. All of that was last week. And now this week, China is continuing to fight back. First, Xi Jinping has been on a diplomatic tour of Southeast Asia, visiting Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. He had particularly notable success in Vietnam, signing some major trade deals with this nation that is really supposed to be a U.S. partner. President Trump was very vocal in his criticism of that and the way Vietnam seems to be kind of switching sides and going over to the Chinese camp. But China, even with that, was not done. This week, the Chinese also started to specifically target U.S. services. So services are things like transportation and banking and insurance and software development, education, medical consultations, entertainment, legal consulting, and things like that. This is a massive part of the U.S. economy. It makes up more than 1/3 of America's total exports. For some reason, President Trump never factors services in when he's talking about our trade deficit with other nations, which is strange because in services, we actually have a surplus with many European and Asian nations. And in several cases, our surplus in services is enough to offset our deficit in goods. So it would be prudent for President Trump to have factored services in. I think that that would have tempered some of his decisions, and it may have kept him from alienating so many U.S. allies and partners. And that way, those allies and partners could be helping America to put pressure on China. You know, these countries have also suffered for decades because of China's toxic trade practices, so that would have helped us. But instead, we basically attacked all these countries at once, friend and foe alike, in some cases quite unjustly. But President Trump may not know about services. I don't know. He always emphasizes manufacturing and goods. But in any case, China definitely does know about services and is now going after American services. Yesterday, the Chinese began a broad boycott of U.S. financial services and travel and legal and consulting, and some others as well, and this could be quite a blow. Wendy Cutler is vice president at Asia Society Policy Institute, and she said yesterday, quote, "Beijing is clearly signaling to Washington that two can play in this retaliation game, and that it has many levers to pull, all creating different levels of pain for U.S. companies." End quote. So anyway, it is clear that China has no interest in going to the negotiation table, at least not yet. And they are intent on retaliation and retribution and ultimately war. So it does look like the U.S. and China may well decouple their economies if this isn't resolved soon. So we could see a divorce between the world's two largest economies. And really, this should not come as a surprise to Trumpet World viewers, because we've been warning about a major confrontation that will soon happen between China and America for as long as we've been on the air. There is a prophecy about a mart of nations in Isaiah chapter 23, and it shows that in the near future, China will work with several other nations to actually block the United States out of world trade and then to even besiege the U.S. So if the China-U.S. trade alliance were intact, that kind of thing would be terribly costly and painful for China to target the U.S. in that kind of a way. You know, the U.S. is currently China's largest trade partner, so that would really pulverize the Chinese economy. But if China and America continue to decouple right now, then the cost for China to carry out this future besiegement would be far lower. So there are some extremely tumultuous times on the horizon. That is very clear. And if anyone would like to understand the Bible prophecies that tell us all about what to expect, we have an article that explains it all in detail. It's called The Great Mart of Nations. And then I also wanted to talk about a couple of smaller Asia stories as well. First, a quick update about Russia's war on Ukraine. So on Sunday, we saw one of the deadliest civilian attacks of the whole war. President Putin, we know, often strikes civilian targets, just hoping to basically terrorize the people and wear them down and make them want to give in. He does this especially when his military isn't having as much success on the battlefield. So on Sunday, Russia fired some ballistic missiles at Sumy, Ukraine, near the city center. And this was on Palm Sunday around 10 a.m. So it was carefully timed to strike when many civilians were out walking to church. And it was a success for Russia. They managed to kill 35 people, including several children, and they wounded more than 100 others, in many cases blowing off their arms and legs, things like that. So it's really just an indescribable nightmare that these people are living through. Their crime is not wanting to surrender to Putin's tyranny and become a part of his whole system. So he's doing everything he can to make them pay for that. And it really just makes you hope that this horrendous war can end soon and end in a way that will not reward the Russians for their demonic brutality. And then one final short story here about North Korea's role in helping that Russian war. North Korea, of course, is a small country. It's only about 26 million people, but a huge number of those people are essentially slaves to their government. And the government is able to invest a massive amount of its resources into the military sector because of that, essentially that slave system. And it's able to field a massive army and produce a stunning amount of weaponry. And so a new report this week found that this weaponry has been a major part of what has helped Russia to keep its war going. This was published Tuesday by Examining Open Source Center data. And they found that over the last 20 months, North Korea has sent Russia 64 trains loaded with artillery rounds and other weaponry like rocket launch systems and missiles. So it's 64 trains and 16,000 containers on those, all just filled with this artillery and other items. And it is making a big difference in Russia's war. Hugh Griffiths is former coordinator of the panel that monitors sanctions on North Korea, and he said, quote, "North Korean artillery shells are a strategic imperative. Without them, Putin would have lost his war in Ukraine. Russia simply doesn't have the industrial capacity to produce the ammunition it needs. It depends on North Korea." End quote. So it sounds like in many ways, North Korea is a decisive factor, and its help means that this devastating war can keep on going for who knows how much longer.
Well, here in Europe, and I'm coming to you from the Netherlands today, there's a lot of people, governments, news outlets on holiday and even taken the whole week off with Easter coming up this weekend. So the main news story really is driven by the United States, and it's this same trade story that we've heard about from Andrew and Jeremiah. The EU is really being pushed into a position in this trade war where they're having to choose a side between the two antagonists that you've just been hearing about, America or China. According to a leak to the Irish Times, Donald Trump is basically offering various nations a simple deal. We will give you a free trade deal or something pretty close to it if you take the tariffs that we're putting on China and you put those on China yourself. So it really is a dividing line. Whose side are you going to be on? And it seems very clear the UK is working to be on America's side with this. It'll be interesting to see if they then end up putting tariffs on China the same way that America is doing. The EU is facing this decision, and the EU is being pushed into this decision from the China side as well. So according to the German press, there's at least one European firm that has been blocked from receiving rare earth minerals from China. So rare earth minerals, these are vital ingredients in all technology. Whatever your device you're watching this on, it will have rare earth minerals in it. It doesn't need tons of them, but they're necessary in small amounts. They are all over the world. America has a massive deposit of them in Arizona. Greenland, they get talked about a lot. The thing is, they're very expensive and they're very polluting to mine. And China doesn't mind mining them in an incredibly polluting fashion and poisoning everybody downriver, etc. So they can mine them much cheaper than anyone else in the world. And what has happened is most other rare earth mines have shut down and everyone is very, very dependent on China. So China has told America, well, we're not sending you rare earth minerals. Then they were also telling EU firms, reportedly this week, we will only sell you rare earth minerals if you can guarantee us you're not going to pass them on to the United States and whatever you make with them will not be passed on to the United States. This is a similar ultimatum from China, saying, okay, Europe, we will trade with you, but not if you trade with the US. And America is saying, Europe, no, you will trade with you, but not if you trade with China. Which camp will Europe fall into? And even just some analysis of the situation can give you a pretty strong indication, at least where they'll end up long term. In general, the EU sells to America, but they get their raw materials from China. If America cuts them off, they can't sell. If China cuts them off, they can't buy. That's a bigger problem. If you can't buy the raw materials, you're not going to have anything to sell at the end of the day anyway. But this is also a story where Bible prophecy tells us exactly where we're going to end up. And you got a good summary from Jeremiah about some of these prophecies. And he talked about Isaiah chapter 23 and this mart of nations that, as he said, prophesies a showdown between China on the one side and the United States on the other. But what that same passage says is that Europe will be on the China side. In Isaiah chapter 23, it uses Tyre to describe this modern financial capital, or this end-time financial capital. And you can look in Revelation 17 and Revelation 18, and it describes the beast power as being the dominant center of world trade. Tyre refers to the commercial arm of the beast power, you could say. And it's very easy to show that the beast power is this 10-nation superpower that will soon rise in Europe. So that superpower is going to be allied with China. And as Jeremiah said, those two are going to work together to block America off from world trade. So this pick a side is right in line with Bible prophecy. Now, of course, the EU is going to be working very hard not to lose out on both of these markets for now. And I think they'll need a strong man before they're in a position to kind of completely do away with their reliance on the United States. So how this develops in the next few weeks, we'd have to wait and see. Certainly over the long term, they are going to be in the China camp. And that article that Jeremiah mentioned will help you prove exactly that. That's the great mart of nations. And I just wanted to conclude with a couple of fascinating articles that we had on Europe this week from Joshua Michels. The first was called Germany, Our Weapons Are Terrible, Ukraine, They Are Great. And I like this article because I got in on Monday and I was seeing all of these headlines about how terrible German weapons are and German tanks, etc. And that warms my British heart. Sorry to our German listeners, but we're always a little bit jealous about German manufacturing. And so to hear that their weapons are actually terrible, I like that. I like to hear that. I like to believe that. I wanted to believe it. And then Joshua's article, though, comes along and shows there's much more to the story. And actually, you go and you talk to Ukraine that's using German weapons right now, and they're really enthusiastic about them. So the Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, he said, by no means have these weapons been unusable, or by no means are these weapons unusable. German weapons are among the best we have. And what he points out is, part of this is German reluctance to sell weapons to Ukraine. You're like, oh, you don't want our weapons, they're terrible anyway. But then also, there is a very sincere desire for Germany to perfect their weapons and improve them. And so they're putting out these reports looking at, okay, well, where are their failings? And they're focusing on the failings because that's what they want to address to make better weapons. It's not because these weapons are terrible. But there is a determined effort to make the best of their weapons. And of course, that's something that is very much prophesied. I mean, Revelation 7:13 talks about the whole nations of the world saying, who could make war with the beast? They're just invincible, seemingly. And a lot of that is because of these incredible weapons. So that's a great place to go to hear more on that. And then he had another article as well. Has Germany's military been chronically underfunded? And you hear this all the time. And I might have even slipped into saying it on this show. Like, oh, Germany's army for the last 10, 20 years, it's been dramatically underfunded. You hear stories about German soldiers showing up with broomsticks because they can't afford guns. And again, Joshua delves a bit deeper and gives you the full picture. Yeah, there's some shortage in some fundings in areas and things like that. But overall, Germany and Europe is in a much better situation with a much bigger military right now than actually when they were at the height of the Cold War, when they were spending a much, much bigger proportion of their economy on their military. And it's a really compelling case that he makes. So has Germany's military been chronically underfunded? You can get both of those articles on our website, thetrumpet.com, and all the material that we've mentioned on the show, you can get there. That's thetrumpet.com. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you for bearing with us in this bit of this impromptu format. Again, we're traveling for the spring holidays, not for Easter, but for the holidays commanded in your Bible and that the original apostles kept. And you can read more about those in our free book, Pagan Holidays or God's Holy Days, which you can get that on our website too. And there's some great Christian living information there for you, some essential information there. Thank you very much to George Haddad and Victor Granados for engineering and production. We'll be back on Wednesday, hopefully with a special edition filmed at least partly in and around Brussels. And until then, keep watching your world.